while I'm collecting up quizzes. All good. I'm actually glad to have people here. I had just about convinced myself I was going to be talking to a blank camera. I'm collecting up quizzes right now. Oh, that's right. That's fine. That's fine. I thought I'd start today by just seeing what y'all's opinion was. Now that you have done narrative analysis from two different versions of narrative theory, you have Fisher's version of narrative theory that's a little bit more open-ended and has only the two criteria that are more encompassing. And then you've tried it from this more detailed, systematic approach to narrative theory. And I thought I'd ask what y'all thought comparing the two. Which did you like better? Show of hands. Who liked the two criteria, more open-ended narrative? Okay. Who liked the more systematic version of narrative theory? Yeah? Okay. Good. Maybe it's not a good question to ask because what you're really going to tell me is that it depends.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me what it depends on then.
The situation and what kind of information you're trying to get out of it.
Can you pinpoint some situations where it would be particularly better to do the more detailed criteria? Or conversely, can you point to some situations that you know would be particularly good for more open-ended?
It's almost, well, I'm not sure.
I don't have a way.
I think for the situations, it would change depending mostly on genre of narrative. So, like, you would use a different set of criteria specifically for, say, rap than
Absolutely.
for bedtime stories or letters to the editor.
And so what you're saying, I think, if I may summarize, is that if you're comparing only within a single genre of narrative, it may be useful to approach it from a more systematic way where you can do this kind of detailed coding work that you seem to like. But if you're comparing across genres, or if you're dealing with narratives of a sort that you couldn't guess what are the important things to code for, either because it's from a different culture, or because it's in response to something fairly new, or trying to do something experimental, like literature, for example, where you know one of the goals is to do something different, new, unseen before. And so there you would want more open-ended criteria for your narrative theory, like Fisher gives us. And you could still use Fisher's theory on pretty much any narrative, even things that are not normally thought of as narratives, like scientific articles, are amenable to being evaluated for coherence and fidelity, right? Good. What else did y'all think as you were working through? Did you find some good examples for this kind of narrative theory work? No?
I couldn't manage. I seen a couple.
That would work.
I couldn't like find certain framing codes to kind of link the two between each other.
Good. That's actually a really useful result, i.e. the theory falls short because it doesn't deal well with anything other than a fairly narrow, even within its own narrow range for genre. Letters to the editor about environmental issues, it doesn't have as many framing devices as exist.
But if it did, though, I think we could have managed with this situation.
Right, right. And sometimes it's also difficult because there's sometimes more than one, depending on the piece, of course. Were you able to identify at least some useful things like the different degrees of complexity in the letters to the editor? Okay. At any rate, at least you see how the process works. It's good also because it does keep you remembering to be critical about these approaches, i.e. our author comes to some conclusions, but they're based on a fairly limited set of codes and are clearly not taking into consideration all of the realm of possible. And that's the drawback of trying to do narrative theory in a more systematic way. that we're shifting towards now are semiotic theories, and in many ways they're very similar. For example, framing devices can be thought of in terms of semiotic theory, as well as in terms of narrative, which is an essentially rhetorical theory. What do you remember about what I had said kind of characterizing rhetorical theories in general?
Was it that it assumes that people are logical and rhetorical?
That they're at least capable of intention and acting towards that intention intelligently, deliberately. Semiotic theory doesn't assume very much regarding individual people. Like systems theory, semiotic theory tends to approach from a big picture perspective. Unlike systems theory, it tends to be a little bit more empirical, a little bit more microprocess oriented instead of very macro oriented, the way we kept seeing with systems theory. Right? Our frustration with systems theory is that it sounds great in the abstract, but when you actually try to get down to the nitty-gritty of applying it, we kept finding ourselves frustrated a little bit, remember? With semiotic theory, it starts from, in general, fairly precise, exact texts. Key thing to remember when I use the word texts, and if I'm talking about semiotic theory, it can mean literally anything. It can mean a haircut, it can mean a line of text, it can mean an artifact from an ancient civilization. So, for example, the articles that you have your choice of for reading are both dealing with semiotics of objects. In one case, architecture, in one case, surgical instruments. And you'll have your choice, both are up. I think you'll like these ones. I don't know which ones you'll choose. I will be curious to find out. There's two basic approaches to semiotic theory. All of them arise out of, well, all right, let me trace it all the way back. For those of my grad students in particular who like knowing how things go back to their roots. Some of you know who St. Augustine is? Yes, no, maybe?
Heard of them?
Okay. Often held to be kind of the center of the rise of the Catholic Church to power during Roman Empire. Was thought of as kind of the person who helped institutionalize the Catholic Church as something compatible with Roman governance. Because as you might remember, initially those two things had been at odds, and so you had a lot of grandiose clashes with stories of martyrs being thrown to the lions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that stuff. Okay, so St. Augustine is your pivot point, and he talked about signs as essentially, there's three different types of signs he's interested. Those which are essentially automatic, where there's smoke, there's fire. Right? There's lots of examples of places in our world today that also function as natural signs. So, for example, if a woman is breastfeeding, she was pregnant at some point, right? We know that if the mercury is registering below a certain point, then whatever precipitation comes down will be in the form of snow. Those are all examples of signs that are natural, and we think of them as fairly direct links. You know, if you think it through, that there are exceptions. They're signs, which means they're not the thing itself. You can have smoke without fire. We can all think of examples, right?
Smoke grenade.
Excellent. Smoke and mirrors for theater, of course. We can also think of examples where there's fire and essentially no smoke that would be visible, right? So it's still a sign, meaning that it suggests the presence of, but it is not the thing itself, or not even necessarily a part of the thing itself. The next level is things that are constructed signs, essentially. So, for example, we read certain cultural events as signs, even though they're constructed. So, for example, if the bell rings, class has started.
Or the assembly line started.
Right, right. And of course at UAF that's not entirely not true. And so it's, in some ways you can recognize the sign, and yet we also recognize places where the sign decidedly doesn't operate. We aren't on an hour system, and yet that's when our bell goes off. Or the chimes, if you think of them as bells. I don't know if you all have noticed that.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Then there are arbitrary signs. In the vast majority of human communication, the signs are arbitrary. There is no relationship between the sign and that which it's taken to represent. And indeed, there's massive variation. Language is the best example of this, right? It does not matter whether I refer to it as cat und Schat, dog versus, I don't remember the word in French, Hund in German. Point is, right, I can have all these different versions and they're signaling to you somehow kind of sort of the same thing, but not. So for example, and this is the example that gets used time after time, what's your mental image?
My dog.
Well, tell us.
German Shepherd.
Yellow
Big.
lab.
Okay, so still fairly big. Active, lots of energy.
Yes.
What do you imagine? What is
Tail
this?
wagging.
Tail. Okay, so good. That's actually really nice because sometimes we use signs to link to other signs. In other words, rather than representing the complete or a specific beast of the type, the important bit is the tail wag, right? That's what matters in terms of relations to humans, right? And so it's linking to another sign, and that sign we take to be a sign of happiness or friendliness, right? Which is the critical variable for our uses. That changes. One of the important points is that in addition to an immense variability in the arbitrary nature of what we use to symbolize, there's immense variability in what is being symbolized. And no two people will have the exact same response, right? As we already demonstrated here. And you can demonstrate even wider variety, especially as you get greater variation across cultures, across different, right? If you go to Vietnam, it's still food, right? Although this one would symbolize food, because this is our symbol, and it's not going to be the same symbol. And yet somehow we think there's an equivalence. We say we could translate, and yet it's not. So one of the valuable things that semiotic theory highlights for us is that even when we think we're communicating, there's this gap, right? There's a gap in the signs used, there's a gap in the signs in what's being represented. It's also difficult because these symbols are arbitrary, and so they change a lot across contexts, time, etc. So, for example, her image of dog that she's using right now is not going to be the same image of dog that she used when she was littler. And I don't know what that would have been. Before you had a dog, what was your symbol? What would have, maybe you can't tell.
My childhood dog, probably,
probably.
before
Okay.
my adult dog, I guess.
Right, oftentimes, like, for little children, especially if you had a dog in the family that was large, right, dog means bigger than. It's something you ride. Right? It's in the category like horse,
Yeah.
only not. And so obviously it changes across contexts over the course of time, so forth and so on. And so we need to deal in some way with the fact that semiotic theories prioritize those signs, right? That's what you're studying, the specifics. And yet it's essentially just a placeholder for something else. So how do we deal with that? There's been essentially two approaches that have been attempted. Mead represents a really nice example of one of those two approaches. Mead is interested almost entirely in the interior, in what's going on in what we are doing with our signs. And so, like Ronnie said, the point is what it means for us, like as in what are we going to do with this? Like how does it impact, how, do we have something that we need to respond to? Is it something we can use? So forth and so on. So what's interesting is to go inside. And so the looking glass self is kind of Mead's vision of all those signs in conjunction in how we use them and how others use them at us, combine to create a sense of self. And that we don't come to a sense of self in the absence of having these abstractions to work with. It only arises through interaction, in other words. So while psychology, and that's why I'm looking in your direction, sorry, don't mean to pick on you to force you to represent all of psychology, the discipline, to us. While psychology has this notion of a central self, a true core, an essence of Ronnie, Mead and others come from the position that there isn't humanity, human self, arises in interaction with other humans and does not pre-exist. We've got some good evidence to suggest that that's probably true. And that without those signs and the social systems that support them, that circulate the signs, like animals, we don't recognize ourselves. And so, cats are pretty famous, for example. Even dogs, they're so smart, right? But they don't recognize themselves in the mirror. They don't know how to reflect back on self. Only humans do that. And maybe dolphins.
Chimps.
Not very reliably. Only after we've started teaching them. After we start interacting with them, chimps they develop that. But wild chimps don't recognize themselves in mirrors. Only after we start being interested in the mirror ourselves and interacting and playing, they develop that.
I wonder if ravens do that as well.
I don't know. That would be an interesting question to ask. And of course, it's not the be-all and end-all for criteria for intelligence. Right? Animals and humans can be perfectly intelligent without necessarily having an advanced sense of self to be able to recognize. Not the point. I didn't mean to go off on. Although animal semiotics are an area of study. And semiotic theory is nice because it's flexible enough that I can use it to study animals, or architecture, or surgery, or whatever else I want. And so it's among the most widely adapted theories. So Mead's vision is that through these interactions, one develops a sense of who one is. And so we are linguistic creations all the way down. In which case, one of the outcomes of that would be a conclusion much like what Sapir-Whorf conclude. And that's the famous name for if you want to talk about what we call linguistic determinism.
That's where language is a lens, pretty much, and if you speak a different language, you have a different viewpoint.
Right. To speak a different language is to have a different world, to live in a different world. And Mead would probably go that way also. The drawback, so all of these are examples of semiotic theories whereby what's important is the sign and the self. What's not important in that And so notice what's changed here from Augustine. There's no longer the possibility of what we would think of as natural signs. Essentially all signs, because they're mediated by the interior, by the human brain, they only exist within your mind. And so there's not a strong link to any external reality. There's no, therefore, any agreement on what it is that we're observing arises because of social interactions, right? You see that as a recycling bin. Nobody disagrees with me that it's a recycling bin.
But it's more than a recycling bin.
Might well be more than, maybe it's actually a teleportation device. I don't know. What we think it is negotiated among us. And so we all come to agreement that it's just a recycling bin and not a transportation device, not because of what's actually there, but because of your reactions with it. Right? And so we've cut off any sense of link between sign and object. Right? Instead, what signs are doing under this conception is that sign links to brain, we're going to call it self. Sign also links to signs, right? We come to agreement through the use of other words. I mean, you know what recycling means. And we all have certain predispositions to think, recycling? Yes, what a good idea. You've been trained that way. You don't get much choice. And so I have this link to something that is necessarily positively valenced, right? And I can start building from there. And signs link to other signs. It links, recycling is going to link to both its opposite, trash disposal, and presumably it complements things like other environmental sustainable actions.
So it's like a word map.
It is. It is. It's going to nest you into a whole system of other signs. Signs lead to signs, lead to signs, lead to signs.
So could we explore that with like dog?
Sure. We can put in any sign we want, and it's going to do, and it'll do different branchings, obviously.
Oh yeah.
What does
So-
dog link to?
Well, or anybody else want to give it a try?
Dog links to a ball, like dog toys, right?
So it's essentially going to then nest into
Play.
play. It also nests into pet, which nests into responsibility. Because one of the things about doing semiotic analysis, you need to always keep an eye on opposites as well as direct links, right? A sign symbolizes as much by what is not as by what it is. I understand dog because it's not cat. I understand play because I understand responsibility. Right? Or at least maybe.
I understand play as not fun. Or I understand play because I understand not fun.
Right. And so now I can start to nest out the ways in which, for Jordan, her word map probably means cat, which is the other usual opposite of dog in our pairings, because we always have an antonym, even though dogs and cats are more alike than just about each other. I mean, why is the opposite of dog not reptile? I don't know. But it's always opposite to cat. And so clearly Jordan is going to make that negative association at some level.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if it was right or not because
Well,
it's not like a direct opposite.
It's not right. It's not right versus not right. Because Ronnie's map is going to be pretty different, I'm guessing. Right? If I try to map where are you going to go
I would
next?
have went from dog to protector.
Excellent. And so now we don't have that pairing of versus responsibility. What's our opposite for protector?
Attacking, almost.
Maybe, but my guess is probably vulnerable, i.e. needing protection.
Actually, yeah, exactly. You can go that way with it too. Because, I mean, a dog could be a protector to its owner, but at the same time,
The owner
yeah,
protects the dog.
hmm
And so,
without an owner, it's vulnerable.
yeah, exactly. And when, the worst kinds of stories are those in which the owner is not protective of the dog and in fact abuses the dog, right? And this is going to call up a whole different host of connections. And so we'll still eventually have in here somewhere linked notions of pet. Which is going to link to other things that one must protect. The pairing against cat now plays out a lot differently. Cat as not vulnerable makes a lot of sense, right?
See a lot of stray cats.
Everywhere except for Alaska,
Yeah, it's cool.
because our cats die if they're not protected, right? Very vulnerable in that sense.
You see a lot of stray dogs as well, don't you?
Not really.
Mm-mm.
It's not like it's
Not
not common, and especially in California, you see
Yeah.
a lot more cats.
A lot more.
I went to Thailand and I saw a lot more stray dogs.
Ah,
So-
right. Which makes total sense, right? Like Vietnam, Thailand is not so very far away from thinking of it as food, not pet, right?
Yeah.
Jordan frowns at me every time I say that.
Farther north, yeah. But where I was down in Ranong, which is on like the tip of
Of the island.
tip of Burma.
Oh, okay.
So like on the isthmus, and you had like Burma comes down to an end, and
Mm-hmm.
where I was staying was like right there.
Oh, so this is still northern.
No, this is southern.
Oh, southern.
South
Okay.
of Bangkok.
South.
South of, I want to say south of Phuket.
Oh, really?
Maybe. I'm not-
Okay.
I don't remember my
Anyways.
geography for Thailand that well
That's okay.
anymore.
I won't either. Tropical though.
Yeah. Still,
Quite tropical.
still tropical. Yeah. 7 degrees away from the equator.
Ah, yes. Okay. Let's work, before we evolve further into, you can see how fun it is doing this kind of work. You can probably also see what semiotics, one of the reasons it's so popular is because it's really useful if something you want to do is marketing, if you can trace out those maps, particularly taking advantage of tracing out the opposites and knowing how to connect there, so that, for example, I can raise fears really effectively in my marketing campaigns. I can figure out, exactly what the fears of disconnection and of loneliness that drive self-owned selection, for example, right? Right? Okay, so it's really powerful for marketing, because while these are unique and individual, there is some sense in which the signs that are going to link most strongly to signs are predictable. And they're in fact derivable if you read through enough material from the culture. And what you're looking for here is pop culture stuff, right? You need things that are timely of the moment, specific to the group that you're interested in targeting for your marketing. But once you've started doing that, you're going to very quickly be able to start picking up on what some of the key words are and what some of the key differentiators are, which makes it really easy, right? Give me enough of a body of texts and I can figure out what links I need to tap into.
And that's why big data is getting so big.
Right, exactly, because it can be seriously powerful fairly quickly. And we have so much of it so readily available now. It's harder with things like a sign from an old culture, right? So how do I make sense of this, this archaeological artifact, this particular statue, what am I going to do with that? I need to figure out enough of the other signs to be able to start making a map of them. But it can be done. The other way to approach, so the drawback of this particular set of approaches to semiotics, which is the dominant approach to semiotics, is that at the end of the day, all you've got is endless chains of signification. One sign linking to another sign, linking to more signs, linking to more signs. You can keep going like that all day through infinite regress. It's not clear that that ever finds an anchor. We kind of have a sense that maybe that web eventually starts to wrap back around itself as those chains of signification keep linking out and linking out and linking out, that we'd like to think it comes circling back around. But it's not really clear that that ever happens. And if so, it happens so differently that it's not clear. I would never be able to say, where did language come from, for example. Our semiotics approaches of this sort give us no way to try to address that. Because if signs just link to other signs, just link to other signs, other signs, other signs, how did we get here? Right? Why do I have different languages?
Variation in geography.
Right. I.e.,
But
chains that are cut from one another. You can imagine sharp breaks along the Pyrenees, for example. Except that doesn't seem like what's actually happened with the history of languages, you know.
well,
Like if you trace language trees, it doesn't seem like they're bounded so much by geography.
it's a combination of factors like geography, politics,
Mm-hmm.
what's popular in the culture at the time, stuff like that.
Right, right. Another way of trying to deal with it, while this version essentially works with just the two sets, self and sign, we could introduce another component, right? And instead of having a pairing of sign with self and then sign with sign, try to maintain some link to externals, such that the sign is not completely always thought of as arbitrary in its relation to a thing, but that there's some anchoring. And the most famous version of trying to do this is Charles Sanders Peirce, who talks a lot about this as the representamen. Right? What is being represented by the sign actually matters. And the reactions to it are not arbitrary. They're not simply based in self. They're constrained. And the object has an influence on what gets done with the signs related to it. So that it's always going to be a three-part structure. Right? We're back to threes. You know, me and my dead Greeks, we like threes. This approach is used by a lot of people that are interested in sort of the more technical aspects of language. And so probably the most famous current theorist doing work on this is Umberto Eco, who is interested in trying to trace out our logic patterns based on understanding signs as being three-part. And so the critical pieces, like for example, you know Boolean operators like and not. And how they're really important to trying to categorize and how we classify and therefore function when we do searches, but also in day-to-day life. Right? Those are your key connectors. And since we think brain works on the basis of connecting, and not become really important to understand. And not is a really hard semiotic problem to get at. Right? What does not represent for us? So it's the ever deferred absence. And it doesn't have a concrete object that it ties to, and yet we all have a very clear idea, and almost every culture has something that stands in and doing that function. That sign is not arbitrary in some important sense. Like if every single language has to have some way of doing that function, there's a commonality, something that's tying it together. And so there's really interesting work being done, and it advances our understanding of logic and how the brain functions, and how we might be able to make computers do a better job with AI, all kinds of important real-world applications. It's also really fun in terms of just applying it to the science that we do. So, for example, things like the platypus, right? The platypus is fairly famous as being an example of, yeah, it's not really a mammal, it's not really a bird, it's not really, it doesn't fall nicely into any of our categories. And so that helps us because it makes us question our categories. Like, what's wrong with us that with how we understand what we think of as evolution? If we've come to this place where we can have things that literally don't belong in any category, and we'll shoehorn it into one category or another, but it doesn't fit nicely there. And yet there it is. There are platypuses.
Break free from categorization like the platypus.
Everybody knows what, y'all know about platypuses, right? Yeah, okay. Just making sure. Useful, good for understanding. It stops us from thinking that when we've got categorization of, for example, people down, it reminds us, no, we probably don't, because there's going to be a person that comes along in the same way that violates. And so, for example, you know that waitresses categorize, right? Any restaurant that you go to, the waitresses will be able, if they choose to open up with you about it, they'll be able to tell you who the types of customers are. And you know, you'll have the birthday celebrators, you'll have the family with kids, you'll have the hurried boss, you'll have the miserly college student, you'll have, right, these different types. And the service you get depends on what type you've been put into. But it's also useful because while that makes their ability to prioritize who they focus on for serving much faster, it's also problematic. And it's good to every once in a while force them to kind of remember there are those that don't fall into one type or another, right? And so you have to keep your categories flexible. And there are going to be people that seem like a perfect example of both, maybe, somewhere, right?
So there can be problems with that though, regarding waitresses, because they'll, you know, say they get a family or a birthday party, a big size, and they don't know, you know, they prioritize, okay, who gets their meals first.
Right.
In my opinion, I think the kids should get their meals first because they can't wait, or their attention span, I should say, is, you know, query. So you know, so say the parents get their food first, you know, and then you got your kids, you know, kind of complaining or whatever it is. I don't think that's good service.
And it's not, well, and of course, it's never, sorry.
Like a catch to that as a parent would be though, it's hard when your kid's done eating before your food comes, and then they're, let's go mom, let's go, I'm done eating, and you're trying to finish your plate too.
Yeah. So how would a waitress in that position know what to do?
Well, and of course, have any of y'all worked? Yeah. So what do you do
They're like
when you have
5
large parties? Right. So what do you do when you have a large party that has kids?
Well, and that's traditionally you would give them first, like you would give the kids food first, or you would give them like crayons or something to tie them over where they're waiting for it.
Yeah.
Right.
But that was always what I did as a server, was always give the kids their food first. So I agree with you, but from a mom perspective, it made it challenging. Maybe it's just my particular child.
Oh no, I'm sure it's true for many. Typically in most restaurants, what I find is that, and no, this is not what I find. I actually have never dealt with kids, and so this is not my finding. What I have generally read in most literature and talking to people is that large parties get handled entirely separately, and so the party as a whole is left to last, and is usually team talk, team served. You wait until somebody else is able to find an opening in their shift, and we'll try to do the whole party all at once, but that means that party waited, and I probably snuck in a side table, a single, right, the boss that's dining in a hurry, but usually dining alone, and so it's really easy to sort of slip that in, and so often we'll get served faster than the party of 15.
Oh,
Which-
completely.
We say that, but at the same time, he's got a point. The faster you can get them served, the better. Why are you serving the person who is obviously quite capable, even if he gets grouchy about it? He's got enough self-control that he's not going to flip out, not going to start throwing food.
Well, then she won't be tied out taking care of him while you're still trying to give all of your attention to the table as opposed to getting him his food first, then actually you're spending more time on your party.
Right, okay. Endless chains of signification. And then every once in a while something comes along that breaks it, right? The party that can't be handled as a single party. Right, the party that, for whatever reason, is just, it doesn't work.
And that's when you bring a high authority.
Right, yes, and so we break out of our current chain and we level it. And so one of the beautiful things that Bart tells us to do is that actually it's often, when there are problems with our signs, there's a really easy way to fix it. We shift to a meta-communication type of thing. Either invoking authority or by invoking ideology more often. And so Bart will talk about this in terms of myths. Don't pay attention to the fact that that word has certain connotations in our popular culture, because what Bart is meaning by it is the way in which we have some signs that kind of function at a higher level and kind of function as almost God signs.
So,
I.e., we can invoke them to problem solve and to put a temporary stop to the endless chaining.
So kind of like archetypes.
More like archetypes.
Yeah.
But God signs really is a good word to refer to it. God and devil signs. That's Burke's terminology for my OA students. He uses the pair of terms, God and devil terms. But examples are things where you're not allowed to question. So for example, love is often used that way, right? It's a sign that you're not allowed to question. It's kind of taken as an absolute. You're allowed to question it at some levels, but it's an accepted motive that kind of puts a stop to the chaining of signification, because we understand we're never going to have an exact definition of that. And yet it functions as this controlling term for motivation, for understanding the self. Does that make sense? And that's in our culture, right? I mean, clearly that use of that term is an ideological one and does not translate well. You try translating that into Chinese. There is no equivalent. You get about 25 different options for how you could translate it. Similarly, even trying to translate it into another Western language, there is usually no simple translation, because we use it for all of these different things when we get it all. We use it that way as a stopgap. Try to translate it into even, our closest related languages like Latin has at least 3 different terms that would be used instead, and none of them translate directly.
What about even within a dialect, such as British English or Australian English?
Right, and I suspect probably, and I can't 100% be certain, maybe we need to find somebody who speaks a different version of English, British English, or Australian English. Even Canadian English, I suspect it wouldn't have the same force because of how we use it.
yeah, there's a swimmer, actually, she's from New Zealand.
Oh.
And so it's, when she speaks English, it's hard to really understand what she's saying, but at the same time, I understand it.
It's just the words mean something different.
Yeah, and I had a teammate last year who was from Australia.
Oh.
it's kind of weird because, you know, well, I know New Zealand as a whole, it's all different from Australia, but
Mhm.
her dialect and his dialect, her dialect was more of a tougher tone, and her dialect was more of a tougher tone, and his dialect was
Really?
more softer.
Really?
Yeah,
That's
Though
not what
I
I would
thought-
have expected.
exactly.
I would have. I
And-
wonder if that's in part because that's how they need you to see them, to try to break the categories a little bit, i.e. our Australian knows that we think of it as the continent of criminals in some sense, and so is softening it deliberately? Do you
Well,
think? Maybe?
I'm not sure, but maybe his religion has something to do with it.
That's
He's Mormon,
okay.
so maybe that.
The
that might-
intersecting identities.
Yeah.
One of the nice things that Mead highlights for us is that we all do have multiple identities. And so since there's no longer meant to be thought of as a core self, instead you are a series of roles. And our role in one area is going to intersect with our role in another area to come up with interesting contradictions or juxtapositions like you're pointing to with our Australian Mormon, or Mormon Australian.
Yep.
And I don't know how you would write that out, but that would be an interesting case. And similarly, everybody here has multiple roles, multiple selves, therefore. Right? There's the Jordan that is the mom, there's also the Jordan that is the waitress, and those two are at odds. In some ways. Right? In some ways complementary, obviously. Cool. I'm blanking on what I came to a full stop because I'm blanking on what I had designed for a good exercise to illustrate this one. And so I may need to email y'all with the instructions because I had set out a good way for you to be able to start trying to isolate some of the different intersecting roles. I think I'm going to have to just email it. So your Wednesday assignment will come to you once once it comes back to me.
I know I wasn't here last Friday, but I did my last for my.
Oh, if you have it, you're welcome to turn it in.
Oh, I don't. I
Okay.
write it, but I can just tell.
Go
you.
ahead and do so.
So